Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. It's a real pleasure to welcome you here to Newnham College and to this second seminar in the new series being launched by the Margaret Anstee Centre for Global Studies. My name's Emma Maudsley. I'm the director of the centre. We're unusual in having a research centre based in the college, and that's thanks to a very generous donation from Dame Margaret Anstee, a woman who rose to become the first woman Under Secretary General of the UN. So I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Dr. Ilias Alami. Ilias and I go back a way. I think we first met when I visited Maastricht University, and Ilias has also worked in Uppsala and Manchester. He's gone all around the world on very prestigious fellowships. I think his name is very well known to a lot of people here. He's an incredibly exciting and I think important scholar in understanding what's going on in the world. Do the chairs at the front and do just grab some at the back as well, if you like, whatever you. I had the good fortune to attend a bit of the teaching that Ilias is doing, and I expect there are some of his master's students here tonight. And I don't know about you, but I thought it was brilliant. Yeah, and next year I'm going to all of the course because I was like, oh, that's what it means. I was sitting there as somebody who's worked in the field, and Ilias is teaching us that beautiful combination of sophisticated and clear, something that many academics strive for and few achieve. And I think it's also the sign of somebody who really knows their subject, actually, that they can teach it. We don't normally talk about teaching when we're introducing researchers, but for me, I think it's such an important facet of a really good academic. But Ilias's research is on show tonight, and I will hand over to him. Just to let you know, if you need the loo, go through the glass doors and turn to the right. We're going to do a sort of talk about 45-50 minutes, Q&A, and then we have a reception, soft drinks and wine outside. Please do stay and have a glass of something and chat. Over to you, Ilias. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Emma. I'm not sure what to say after such a generous and kind introduction, really. But yes, pleasure to be here. It's actually my first talk here at Cambridge since I joined, which is very nice to be here in such a nice setting and everything. So, and I can see some very familiar faces as well. Yes, very excited. Okay, so let me time myself so that I don't go wild with the timing, which I have a tendency to do, as my students know. Okay. All right, so the title of my talk today is Futures of State Capitalism in the Global North, East and South. This is based on on some research I've been doing over the past 5 to 6 years, most of it with a close collaborator and friend of mine, Professor Adam Dixon, who's now based at Edinburgh Business School. And so the talk draws upon a range of papers we've already published, as well as a book which is coming out later this year, which we're pretty excited about. But I'll tell you a few words about this in a moment. Okay, so let me start by offering a simple definition of state capitalism. I think it's quite important to start from here, insofar as a lot of discussions about state capitalism don't start from a definition. So here we go. State capitalism refers to a capitalist social formation whereby the state plays a particularly strong role in the economy, often directly assuming the role of a capitalist, that is, owning or controlling assets and means of production and directly accumulating capital in its own right, or directly creating and shaping capitalist markets. So you have those two aspects, the sort of owning capital directly as well as creating and shaping markets. So this is a phenomenon which is really old, perhaps and arguably as old as capitalism as a mode of production itself. And it's taken a great variety of shapes and forms historically. I'll just give you a few examples here. Got imperial chartered companies in the long 16th century, government economic planning agencies, public utilities, national oil companies, policy banks, state-owned investment funds, and many others. Now, when you hear about the new state capitalism, and you probably have if you read the financial press, you will often see these types of representations. So as you can see, when people in the business press talk about the new state capitalism, often what they have in mind is China, or perhaps other so-called emerging markets like Brazil and others. Now, the idea, when people mobilize this notion of state capitalism in this type of environment, really is to say that the version of the models of capitalism that exists in those countries is qualitatively different than the ones that exist in the West. And the argument is that those economies are characterized by a very strong state footprint, and that sort of gives capitalism a flavor in those economies, which renders it really different from the more free market or neoliberal capitalism that allegedly prevails in the West. And often when people make this point, is really to say that there is something wrong about capitalism in those economies. Now, you can see similar types of tropes amongst Western policymakers and state leaders. This is a quote from US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. The quote is from last year, I think. He says, "We should insist on competing in a rules-based system that protects our people from the aggressive state capitalism of modern autocracies." This is from the European Commission. The quote is from an important report, which is the Trade Policy Review, which is an outline of the strategic position of the European Commission for the next few years. And it says, "The rapid rise of China, demonstrating global ambitions and pursuing a distinct state capitalist model, has fundamentally changed the global economic and political order." So as you can see, there's this denunciation of China and other emerging markets as, again, being the host of this sort of deviant version of capitalism, which is upending global economic markets and global governance as a whole, and posing a threat, really. Now, according to some academics, this new state capitalism is also a story about emerging markets. Here's a few influential books, which are essentially making the argument, again, that state capitalism is something that comes from emerging markets. This one is perhaps the most significant. Ian Bremmer, he's not quite an academic, he's more of a consultant or a pundit, really. He's the head of the think tank Eurasia Group. And his point is really that there's this, again, new version of state capitalism coming from the East, and it's really threatening free markets, globalization, democracy, the liberal world order, everything that we have that is good. And those other books are obviously a bit more nuanced and more interesting in my view, but sort of make a similar argument in the sense that state capitalism, again, is sort of located in those emerging economies. And the point is that they're trying to identify, again, the sort of model in those economies that is very different from the ones that we have in the West. Now, one of the key arguments I'll be making now is that far from being limited to emerging economies, contemporary state capitalism is actually a global phenomenon. And in order to understand what it is about, we actually need to look at what has happened to global capitalism over the past 20 years or so. And to convince you of this argument, I'll start by showing you a few empirical data points. I think some of my students will recognize some slides here, so bear with me. There'll be some new stuff also. So let's start with sovereign wealth funds. As of 2023, there were 176 sovereign wealth funds, which is a more than six-fold increase since 2000. Now, sovereign wealth funds, simply put, are pools of money which are then invested through financial markets or across a wide diversity of sectors and so on. And those pools of money are either owned or controlled by states. So those sovereign wealth funds have assets under management worth $12 trillion, which is a massive increase since 20 years before, from less than $1 trillion in 2000, which is more than hedge funds and private equity firms combined. So we're talking about really big amounts of money here. This is to show you some of the largest sovereign wealth funds. So the Norwegian one is by far the biggest. Well, the Norwegian one and one of the Chinese ones, those two are by far the biggest. And then we also have a few from the Middle East and one from Singapore. But we also have all sorts of funds which have been created across the world economy. And again, this is across political systems, this is across sort of ideological orientations and so on and so forth. So as you can see, there's, so Ifmar Capitalism, Moroccan one, got one in Senegal, Egypt, Angola, Nigeria. Samruk Kazina is from Kazakhstan. PPI France is the French one, got an Irish one, Kazana is from Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on. Now, you also have an interesting trend, which is that some city governments and regional governments have also been created sovereign wealth funds. So a few cities in Brazil have been launching their own sovereign funds. There's also the European Commission, which just announced last year that it's creating the European Sovereignty Fund. So it's interesting because it's sort of a multilateral sovereign fund. And NATO, the military alliance, has also just announced that it's creating a sovereign wealth fund. So the trend is quite significant. At the same time, as we've seen this rise of sovereign wealth funds, we've also seen a remarkable revival of state-owned enterprises, which is quite interesting because, you know, the assumption amongst liberal circles was that as economies would open and liberalize and modernize and so on, state enterprises would become privatized and would simply disappear. Now, of course, there's been a lot of privatization, especially through the 80s and 90s, but we've also seen a remarkable revival of those entities over the past 20 years. Over the past decades, they've doubled in importance amongst the world's 2,000 largest firms. They control $45 trillion of assets, which is equivalent to half of global GDP. So again, talking about big money here. This is just to show you a few examples of very large state-owned enterprises. You've got, obviously, in the oil sector is very much dominated by those actors. You've got some Russian ones, some Brazilian ones, from Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, Norway, China, Algeria with the Sonatrach, and so on. And Eni is from Italy. So those are in the sectors of natural resources, but state enterprises are actually present across a wide range of sectors in energy, transport, manufacturing, and so on. And what's interesting is that they're quite a diverse group in terms of size, complexity, as well as the functions they perform for their government. But they also have now very complex structures of ownership. So, you know, a classical state enterprise from the 20th century, say, would be fully state-owned, whereas now we have all sorts of complex structures of ownership with multiple state and private actors owning those entities. And the important bit, too, is that those have become global corporations. So a lot of them have operations across territorial borders, much like conventional or private-oriented or privately owned, transnational corporations. So this is to show you, again, the geographical distribution of those state enterprises. As you can see, yes, there's a lot in Asia and in the Middle East, but there's also, in fact, a lot in Europe, Western Europe in particular. Yes, and as I said, the sort of new trend here is that there's also a lot of those state enterprises have become multinational corporations insofar as they control assets and firms in countries which are different than their home country. Okay, so we've got several wealth funds, state enterprises. We also saw a return to fashion of national development policy banks. So here, again, quite a diverse group of actors, but their common point is that they are state-owned. They've vastly expanded their loan portfolio and financial capacities in both advanced capitalist economies and in the global south. They're now an important feature of most developed and middle-income countries' financial sectors. A few examples here in China, France, Germany, India, South Korea, Brazil, Mexico, and so on. And according to some recent estimates, there are now more than 900 of policy banks worldwide, and they control assets worth $49 trillion. Here's a couple of interesting books to read about those, if you're interested. Yes, and again, so this is, sadly, those figures are a bit old. I couldn't find anything more recent. So this is from 2016. But as you can see, the geographical distribution of those entities is also quite diverse. So there's a lot in emerging markets, obviously, but also a lot in lower income economies, as well as in Western, richer economies. Now, at the same time as we had this multiplication of state-owned corporate entities, we also had a proliferation of techno-industrial policies and national development strategies. So in the rich world, a lot of those techno-industrial plans aim to boost the design and production of advanced semiconductors, artificial intelligence and cloud computing, clean tech and biotech, and so on. So I'll say a few more words about this in a moment. But in the global south, there's also been a multiplication of those plans, and those are more oriented towards or around the construction of large-scale connective infrastructure. So the idea here is that national development plans would aim to build large-scale connective infrastructure for countries and territories to plug into global and regional value chains as a means to achieve development. But some developing countries have also now designed and this is a bit more recent, a range of strategies to achieve industrialization based on the extraction of critical transition minerals. So you can think about Indonesia, which has a lot of nickel. You can think about Morocco and Hungary, who are trying to position themselves as a hub for the production of electric batteries. And you can think about green hydrogen as well. So countries like Mauritania, Tunisia, Namibia, Kenya, South Africa are trying to design strategies which are industrialization strategies. So again, foster a form of industrialization, but which is based on the production of green hydrogen. So overall, according to UNCTAD, which is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the rate of adoption of both formal industrial policies and individual policy measures appears to be at an all-time high. The IMF has released an infamous paper now a few years ago, which is called The Return of the Policy That Shall Not Be Named, Principles of Industrial Policy. And this is from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which they released a few years back, which is called The State Strikes Back. And you can see, this figure of the 90 states sort of taking over again the economy. This is from even more recent report from the IMF. And this chart is quite interesting. It tracks the mentions of industrial policy in the major business press. And as you can see, there's a very clear upward trend here, which reflects, in the realm of discourse, let's say, material transformations in the world. In addition to that, we've also seen a multiplication of trade and investment restrictions over the past decade or so. So this is from the IMF. Again, to explain a little bit, this is the global flow of goods, services, and finance. So, globalization in a nutshell. And as you can see, those flows have increased up until a point, and then they're starting to sort of plateau for a bit. They're not decreased, but they're plateauing. But at the same time, or rather not at the same time, but over this period, there's been a multiplication of those trade and investment restrictions, which again is something that has happened at the same time as those other sort of trends that I talked about earlier. And those include export controls, bans on foreign technology, foreign investment screening mechanisms. So this is when states pass bills and legal mechanisms to empower themselves to screen foreign direct investment transactions and decide if they want to let them happen or not, or block them. Trade tariffs, sanctions, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this was just a few empirical data points to offer a sort of background picture here. Now, what I want to suggest here is that the new state capitalism should be defined as an aggregate expansion of the state's role as promoter, supervisor, investor, shareholder, and direct owner of capital across the world economy. So again, not just in emerging markets. And this has been characterized by, on the one hand, a multiplication of state-owned corporate entities. So this is what I just talked about, except for central banks, which I didn't discuss. But as you know, those central banks have become absolutely key actors for the reproduction of global capitalism. They've intervened in ever more sophisticated ways in the economy as a means to backstop liquidity on financial markets and bail firms and so on and so forth. So we've got this multiplication of state-owned corporate entities. And on the other hand, we also had this development of muscular forms of statism, and that covers some of the things that I just mentioned: techno-industrial policies, national development strategies, investment in infrastructure, and trade investment restriction. So what I think is interesting, and that is worthy of research, is to try and understand better the uneven and combined expansion of those two legs of state capitalism, if you will. So in some cases, it's quite obvious because there's very clear examples where sovereign wealth funds have been used as tools of techno-industrial policies, or when state enterprises have been integrated into national development strategies. But sometimes this dynamic of uneven and combined development happens across territorial borders. So for instance, it's not a coincidence that we've had a multiplication of trade and investment restrictions, as well as at the same time, an increasing internationalization of sovereign wealth funds and state enterprises, insofar as those actors become more global, they start to invest in foreign countries, and sometimes those investments are welcome, and sometimes they trigger a reaction on the part of host states, which can be a sort of defensive reaction, hence the multiplication of those trade and investment restrictions. So I guess all this to say that the key question to me is this: why is this phenomenon happening? How to explain it, and with what implications? So what I'm going to talk about now is about trying to answer those questions. And really, one of the arguments I want to make is that there's at least 6 sets of interrelated factors which pertain to the historical development of global capitalism since the turn of the millennium, which combined have facilitated the emergence or have sort of fostered the emergence of this phenomenon, which we call the new state capitalism. So those are technological, geographic, financial, corporate, geopolitical, and economic factors. And I'll say a few words about each of those. So let me start with technological factors. So as you know, capitalism is a remarkably dynamic system from a technological perspective, insofar as firms are compelled by competition to improve labor productivity as a means to do better than their competitors, to generate extra profits. And they do this, of course, by means of technological innovation most of the time. So the point I want to make here is that advanced capitalist states in the West and in East Asia have developed new forms of techno-industrial policies to coordinate the emergence of tech frontiers, and so to support their firms as they engage in this sort of technological competition, and especially in a range of key sectors: advanced semiconductors, nanotech, artificial intelligence, advanced materials, 5G, and so on and so forth. And the reason why those sectors are so important is because they are general purpose technologies. Now, those are technologies which are called general purpose insofar as they can be applied across a very wide range of labor processes and production processes. And so those have the potential to really transform quite profoundly entire economies. And so states and firms have realized that if they are missing out on those technologies, they're basically going to lag behind their competitors as a result of the importance of those technologies. So states have been developing those new forms of industrial policy to support their firms. And for that, they've mobilized sovereign wealth funds and policy banks for strategic investment and low-cost finance to small firms and to national champions, so they could develop and acquire strategic capabilities in these sectors. So again, this is about helping firms as they try and develop strategic capabilities in those general purpose technologies. Those state-owned corporate entities, so sovereign funds and policy banks, have also been used by states to acquire equity stakes, so to acquire participations in firms which are considered strategic, or to control key nodes in strategic supply chains. So a good example of that is actually from a few months ago. The Ministry of Industry in Japan has used a state-owned fund to take equity stakes in one of the firms in the semiconductor supply chain, because it considered that this firm was constituting a key node in the semiconductor supply chain. And so it was too important to let it simply be owned by private entities, and especially they were very worried that a foreign actor would purchase this firm. At the same time, they also used investment restrictions and trade defensive measures to protect critical firms, assets, intellectual property, as well as to control the flows of tech, capital, and talent. So a good example of this, again, the semiconductor sector, as you may know, the US have been very aggressive in trying to prevent China from developing capabilities in the semiconductor sector. So they put in place a range of export controls to prevent firms from exporting those technologies to China. But they've also put in place measures which ban American citizens from working for firms which are related to the Chinese semiconductor sector. So this is about trying to manage the flow of labor, really, or talent in the more mainstream jargon. So those are the sort of technological factors which, okay, so the point really is that you have those technological developments, again, compelled by competition between firms, and this is pushing states to do more in terms of mobilizing state ownership, as well as explicitly interventionist policies. Relatedly, and I'm moving on to geographic factors, there's been a geographic rebalancing of the world economy, which is in fact quite connected to those technological developments. So we've seen quite fast progress in terms of automation and digitalization, which have allowed, and this is, of course has been facilitated by those general purpose technologies that I talked about earlier, This has allowed firms to reorganize labor processes, supply chains, and logistical networks in ways that maximize exploitation across territorial borders. Now, this is a bit, wordy, but I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the story of the formation of increasingly complex and regional, global and regional value chains, which essentially do three things. On the one hand, or rather, this is what they do. They connect frontiers of natural resource extraction, which are largely located in Latin America, Africa, and Central Asia. So, this is the extraction of mining commodities, minerals, agricultural commodities, and so on and so forth. Those value chains connect those to sites of labor-intensive manufacturing, predominantly in East Asia. Of course, a lot of this is in China, but also in the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and so on, as well as in Central and Eastern Europe, especially Czech Republic and Hungary, and other pockets of industrialization, say in northern Mexico, bits of Morocco, bits of Turkey, and so on and so forth. So we've got those two geographical regions being connected, as well as spaces of consumption in urban agglomeration, largely in advanced capitalist economies. So in the West and in some rich regions in East Asia as well. Now, connecting those diverse regions has actually required a very significant investment in infrastructure of the connective type that I talked about earlier. And this has required, of course, massive state involvement. So we saw extensive state involvement in the form of planning and territorial development agencies in both the global north and in the global south. In the global north, this is because states want to make sure that those global value chains are organized in a way that benefits their own firms. And in the global south, as I mentioned earlier, this is because states are attempting to connect to those global value chains as a means to achieve industrialization. And we've also seen large-scale state-led investment, often conducted by state-owned entities, so state enterprises, sovereign wealth funds, and development banks, in energy grids, digital networks, transportation infrastructure, integrated systems of logistical connectivity. So here, again, the argument is that you have this very profound transformation in geographical terms of the global economy, which has required extensive state intervention. And this, I argue, is another sort of factor which has facilitated the rise of the new state capitalism. Let me now move to some economic factors, and especially the role of intensified economic competition and stagnation. So partly as a result of both the technological trends that I talked about earlier, as well as the formation of global and regional value chains, which have allowed firms to generate immense profits. This has also at the same time, and by means of massively increasing productive capacities worldwide, this has been, or the sort of flip side of that is that this has also accelerated situations or led to situations of industrial overcapacity in manufacturing sectors and saturation in certain global industrial product markets. And I'll give you a few examples of that. Sectors like agrochemicals, aluminum, steel, shipbuilding, coal power, so things like heavy industry, as well as more technologically advanced sectors like consumer electronics, solar panels, semiconductors. All of those have experienced, to some extent, situations of industrial overcapacity over the past few years. This has led economists, mostly mainstream economists, in fact, referring to this as secular stagnation, which is a notion which aims to sort of describe this, the sort of economic lack of dynamism that we're experiencing, which is characterized by low manufacturing output growth, low labor productivity gains, and a slowing pace of investment. So this is what is illustrated on the top right there with this cartoon, which is about the difficulties that state authorities experience as they try to boost economies. It's becoming increasingly difficult to catalyze rates of growth that we would consider to be healthy. And this is an influential book on the question of secular stagnation from mainstream economists. So the important bit is that as the economic pie is growing much more slowly, it also becomes much tougher for firms to compete with each other. So we've seen intensification of international competition for industrial firms, particularly post-2010s, or this has become much more visible since in the post-2010s, especially in those sectors, of course. And so states have been called to support their firms more aggressively as they experience this tougher competition, again, via industrial policies, but also by using policy banks, and with the hope of helping firms compete internationally. And we've seen that in sectors like electric vehicles, electric batteries, semiconductors again, but even just the more traditional car industry. And the interesting bit is also that we can see some dynamics of competitive emulation happening there, which is to say that states sort of copy each other as they design plans to boost their industrial sectors. A good example of that is what we're seeing, with the competition for sort of boosting the production of energy renewables and clean tech and so on. So, the US has passed this Inflation Reduction Act a few years ago. This has pushed other states to replicate and to design their own plans. So, the European Union has launched its European Green Deal Act. South Korea has proposed a similar plan. Japan has just passed a bill to launch its own program. So you can see how states sort of mimic each other, and as part of this process of competitive emulation. Another example of that, of course, is again in the semiconductor sector, where the US has launched this US CHIPS Act. The European Union has replied or has sort of launched its own plan to compete with that, the European Union Science and Chips Act. South Korea has launched its K-Chips Act, which is about trying to do the same things, and so on and so forth. Okay, but states have also used trade and investment restrictions to protect firms and key markets from foreign competition. So this is the sort of the complementary trend to this one, which is about supporting their firms compete internationally, but also, and this one is about using defensive measures to protect firms and to protect the market share of those firms within the domestic markets. And this also has a sort of combinatorial dynamic in the sense that this can lead to tit-for-tat retaliation. So the key example of that, of course, is trade wars, where a country would, put in place some tariffs, and another government would sort of retaliate by implementing their own tariffs. And you can see how there's this dynamic can lead to an escalation of trade and investment restrictions. So this is also what has happened. And finally, sovereign wealth funds have also been used by states to, as part of their attempt to deal with this context of secular stagnation, as a means to try and channel capital and investment from the least dynamic sectors to the more dynamic ones. So, for instance, the French state has used its sovereign wealth fund, BPI France, as a means to try and channel capital towards sectors which are closer to the technological frontier and which have a sort of greater growth potential. All this, so the technological, geographic, and economic factor have been sort of enhanced by the role of geopolitical turbulence. So we've seen the new multipolarity of power and economic activity, setting in the world market over the past 20 years, partly as a result of the geographical rebalancing that I talked about earlier. This has manifested, amongst other things, as a hardening of geopolitics with changing relationships between Western capitalist economies, China, Russia, but also many regional powers such as Hungary, India, Turkey, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, and so on. We've seen growing geoeconomic rivalry in the realms of international trade, investment, and technological leadership. So this is the sort of flip side of what I talked about earlier, about firms competing more and more and finding it tougher and tougher to compete. Well, now their states also are feeling this sort of intensification of competition, but in a different form, which is more about geoeconomic rivalry. And we've also seen, states mobilizing more and more aggressive rhetoric, which portrays foreign competitors as threats to the sovereignty, autonomy, and integrity of a nation. All of that has led to a general turn towards more assertive or more aggressive forms of economic nationalism, which collapse the distinction between economic interests and national security. This is very clear if you listen to what policymakers say about the role of advanced technology. Often this is framed as a matter of national security, or increasingly, and I'll say more about this in a moment, climate change or climate imperatives of transition and so on are framed as well as matters of national security, because they are embedded in this sort of turbulent geopolitical context. But my point here is that this has also pushed states to do more. Again, mobilizing state ownership, so sovereign wealth funds, state enterprises have been used to strengthen state control over key strategic sectors, critical resources, and key infrastructure. And policy measures as well have been used to so things like tariffs, ban on foreign technologies, green protectionism to penalize foreign competitors. Okay. Now moving on to financial factors, and especially the role of financial dislocations and financial instabilities. So what we saw over the past 20 years is the formation of an increasingly sophisticated global financial system with a vast expansion of financial flows, but many of which are highly volatile and speculative. States in the global East and South have been particularly exposed to financial vulnerability. That's because of the role of their currency and their positions in the global financial system. And so, of course, because they've been exposed to financial vulnerability, that also means that they've been experiencing a lot of financial crises. But states in richer countries or advanced capitalist economies as well have experienced quite profound difficulties maintaining financial stability, insofar as shocks, so things like COVID or the Russian war of invasion in Ukraine. Those types of shocks also quickly reverberate through the financial system and spread to the world economy. And so the point here is quite simple: is that as there is this, those financial dislocations and instabilities, states again have been pushed to do more to try and mitigate that. They've used enhanced state activism in response to crises, both in the form of direct intervention and state ownership. I'll give you a few examples here. Central banks have become absolutely central actors. So, they've vastly expanded their prerogatives over the past 20 years. They've vastly expanded their balance sheets. So, like basically buying a lot of toxic debt and trying to absorb or compensate for the vulnerabilities of private financial markets. But sovereign wealth funds as well have been used as buffers to protect economies from external macro financial shocks. So Russia, apparently has weathered quite well the sanctions and so on, and that's partly because it's used very smartly its sovereign wealth fund and its state-owned banks as a means to try and contain those shocks. But we can also talk about countries like Saudi Arabia, which has also used its sovereign wealth fund as a means to protect against volatility in oil markets. Policy banks as well, so state-owned banks have been used to extend credit in a counter-cyclical way and or to renationalize banking sectors. So countries like Hungary, Poland, Bolivia, and more, Brazil and so on, have experimented with or have used their state-owned banks in rather experimental and ambitious ways as a means to continue extended credit to the private sector, even when there's a financial shock. And finally, a lot of countries, especially in the global south, but not only, Canada and Iceland as well, have been using capital control. So taxes on speculative financial flows as a means to try and detract those firms. But yeah, this is especially a story in the global south. So countries like Brazil, India, Turkey, Peru, South Korea have experimented with a wide range of capital controls, again, as a means to try and maintain the stability of their financial system as they're exposed to very speculative flows of finance. And if you're interested to read a bit more about this, my first book was on that. Okay, so I'm not going to say an enormous amount of things here, but this is the sort of final factor that I wanted to discuss, which is the role of corporate factors. Now, this refers to the question of corporate restructuring and business strategies. So firms have adapted to this changing context that I just described, to changing financial conditions, changing geographic conditions, changing economic conditions, changing geopolitics, and so on and so forth. And as they did so, they sort of transformed themselves as organizations and also adopted new business strategies. As I said, I'm not going to say too much, but just a few key strategies to just as an invitation to perhaps discuss this in the Q&A. So this is quite well known, in the financialization literature, but a lot of firms have tried to sort of shore up profits by using financial markets and financial instruments. But they've also used quite a lot those financial markets and instruments as a means to enhance organizational power, especially transnational corporations, in order to structure global value chains and to push costs onto subcontractors and subordinated firms. There's also been a turn towards logistics as a site of value creation, as a source of competitive edge. So again, this is quite interesting insofar as competition between firms is not only now about firms producing the best products or in the most efficient ways or in the, in the less costly way and so on. It's also about making sure that those commodities circulate as fast as possible. So it's about accelerating the flow of commodities, not simply about producing those commodities. And firms like Walmart and Amazon, of course, have become expert at that. And this is a tremendous source of value, and therefore a corporate strategy that has been used more and more. A third one is the question of rent. So a lot of rent-seeking strategies, often based on the monopoly control of intangibles. So things like intellectual property. And again, this is used as a source of market power. So you can think here about this, tech giants, which have monopoly control over key hardware or software, and use this as a means to extract rent from other private actors as well as from customers. And finally, the question of concentration. So, as competition became tougher and tougher between firms, it becomes easier to shore up profit rates and profitability levels by buying another firm rather than investing in new production capacities. And so we've seen across a very wide range of sectors a very strong trend towards concentration. So firms buying each other out. So to cut the story short here, the point is that states have been supporting firms across all of those strategies. And again, they've mobilized state ownership, so their sovereign funds, their policy banks, their state enterprises, and so on, as a means to do so. I'm not gonna dwell too much on this because, yes, I should perhaps accelerate a little bit. Okay, so quick recap. This is what I've argued so far. We've got this phenomenon, the new state capitalism, and a range of factors which are contributing to it. Yes, and essentially the argument is that these factors combined have pushed states to expand their roles as promoter, supervisor, investor, shareholder, as well as direct owners of capital. And again, this is not at all, I think it's profoundly wrong to say that it's simply a story about China or emerging markets and so on. This is something that is happening on the planetary level. This is something that has to see with the historical development of capitalism as a global system. Now, and I only have a few more slides left, but I want to look forward a little bit. And obviously the title of the talk was Futures of State Capitalism. So I'm gonna say a few words about the future here. And I want to say some words about the question of climate change in particular. So state capitalism and green futures. The argument is quite simple here. Climate change, in my view, will bear upon all 6 factors that I just discussed and will likely, I mean, this is speculation, of course, but it will very likely, in my view, heighten their salience. I'm not going to go through all 6 factors, but I'll just give you a few examples to illustrate this point. High-tech competition is already becoming a climate issue. So if you look at things like the green subsidies race, which is happening for electric vehicles, states are already portraying the question of competing in those sectors as a matter of climate transition, of course, but also as a question of technological supremacy. And we've seen that across, yes, electric vehicles, renewable energy, clean tech, and so on. And I gave the example again earlier of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, but many countries have launched plans to sort of boost or to offer subsidies to their to firms to produce clean energy and clean tech within their national borders. So we can expect more green techno-industrial policies in the future. I think this is pretty obvious to me. Now, looking more at the geographical factors that I talked about earlier and the question of global value chains, but it is very likely that weather-related events, catastrophic events, and other events related to climate change will disrupt the operations of regional and global value chains, which likely will require significant state activism in the form of state-led investment in infrastructure and territorial planning to reconfigure those regional and global value chains. And I think what we're seeing with the question of onshoring and reshoring and friendshoring and all that kind of stuff, which is about reconfiguring global value chains, is a bit of it's sort of giving us a clue about what this might become. We've also already seen a convergence of climate and geopolitical/security imperatives. This is already underway, and this is catalyzing renewed state interventionism. So, competition between countries to secure energy sources and critical transition minerals. So if you think And this is something that has happened very rapidly over the past couple of years. So, there's this, was, again, Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, which has created this new awareness about, and the sort of disruptions that this created across energy markets, especially gas markets, has made states realize that the question of the climate transition and renewable energy was very much related to the question of geopolitical security. And so we've seen now more and more policies which are framed precisely in those terms, which are combining those two imperatives. Similarly, with the question of critical transition minerals, many states, especially in the West or allied to the West, have realized all of a sudden that, again, supply chains mattered quite a bit. And it turned out that China had managed to control strategic nodes in critical transition minerals, or to the supply chains which are linking sites of extractions of those minerals to sites of processing and sites of production of electric batteries and so on and so forth. And so now we've seen a proliferation of plans which try to boost firms, and Western firms in particular, to try and assert themselves within those value chains. We also know that climate change will induce a lot of financial instability, partly because of the sort of climate catastrophes, but also because of the devaluation of assets which are considered to be dirty. And we know that this is going to create a lot of financial instability, and it is likely to be the case that states will increasingly intervene as a means to mitigate this financial instability. The central banks are already trying to green their operations, which is very much part of this logic. So overall, what we can say is that it is very likely that state capitalism, so this phenomenon that I've described today, is going to deepen in an age of catastrophic climate heating and environmental breakdown. So I only have a couple slides left, and I'll resume. This is a bit dramatic, obviously, but let's try and think about politics and what this might mean. So progressive openings. This is how I decided to call those last two slides, which I think is quite important. Okay, so the question is not if then, but how state capitalism will shape our near future, if I'm correct that we'll see a deepening of state capitalism. So as I see it, the phenomenon of this new state capitalism generates openings for at least two types of strategies and political engagement with and against the state. And I'll conclude by briefly outlining those two strategies. The first one is a sort of reformist strategy, which we can call democratizing and greening state capitalism. So as the name suggests, we already have a state capitalism that is there and likely here to stay. And so can we try and make it more democratic, and can we try to make it greener? Now, the logic of this argument is that there's a window of opportunity here on an ideological level. It is because we're witnessing all of those stuff that states do now. So it's clear that states can, and indeed must, do more for us, notably in terms of redressing inequalities and leading decarbonization transitions. So this is more on an ideological level. In other words, neoliberals and others have been arguing for a very long time that states should not do anything besides, simply regalian prerogatives, so waging war and protecting private property and perhaps maintaining currency and financial stability. But that's about right. That's what they should do. But now what we can see is that as a result of those profound material transformations, there's a lot of ideological uncertainty happening as well. And so this is opening some space potentially for us or for social movements and so on to push for states to do more. So yes, the point is to try and push states to use their newfound capacities and resources, which are already there. They're already doing all that stuff. So the point would be to push them to do things simply in directions that are less socially and environmentally destructive. Hence the question of sort of greening state capitalism. Of course, this would need to be combined with broad-based processes of economic democratization. I think, thinking about greening state capitalism has to go with the question of democratizing our economies. But this is the logic of the proposal. And of course, the whole point of all that is to push states to mobilize green state ownership, green industrial policy, and so on and so forth, as a means to coordinate a massive push to invest in low carbon production systems, green transportation, ecosystems restoration, agroecology, renewable energy infrastructure, housing, public services, climate adaptation, and climate justice. So yes, that's the logic of this sort of reformist strategy as I see it. And finally, So this is the second type of strategy that I see being generated by this historical moment, if you will. And it's perhaps more of a transformational one rather than a reformist one. Although, of course, there's a lot of overlap between the two things, and it's not always clear to establish a clear difference. But we can call this one towards democratic planning and alternative forms of ownership. And the logic of this one is a bit different. As I said earlier, the logic of the previous one is that states are already doing more, and so we can simply, or we can hope to push them to do more in the direction that we would prefer. Now, this is a bit different. This is about the phenomenon of state capitalism really revealing fault lines and cracks in capitalist society. Let me explain what that is. We know that capitalism, as a social system is predicated upon establishing a clear and neat separation between the economic and the political, and the two being constituted as very separate spheres of economic activity, of social activity. And this is quite important in order to empty out the economy from its social content and to make it appear as eternal, as natural, and therefore as immutable. Now, the point here is that we're seeing with this new state capitalism inadvertent repoliticization of the economy, insofar as states are intervening in very visible and very powerful ways, which suggests, all of a sudden, the capitalist economy, so things like the market, competition, prices, and so on, appear in plain sight for what they are, which is social constructs, which are fundamentally underpinned by political power and public authority. So we see the neat demarcation between the economic and the political is collapsing under the weight of this new state capitalism. So what I will suggest here is that this opens space for us or anyone concerned with a livable future on this planet to push for other forms of politicization of the economy, which could be driven by other motives. So, as I said, this shows that social relations of property are not natural, they're not eternal, they can be made different, and the very power to allocate social resources can be organized differently. And I think this suggests that we should think about the potential for radical democratic experiments with planning and alternative forms of public ownership through which communities can own and manage the wealth they produce in ways that balance goals of efficiency, justice, democracy, and equality. In other words, producing things without a profit motive. And so I'll just leave it there. I think this is, as a question mark, might this be a way for us to reclaim power and control over our collective future? Yeah, so I received this morning. This is the cover of the book, which is coming out in a few months. First time I'm showing this cover, so this is a world premiere. The book is coming out in June. It's open access, and yes, it develops quite a lot of things that I talked about today. Thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions and comments and so on.